We are slaying monsters.
Don't let the ghosts and the ghouls disturb you, darling.
I want to suck your blood.
Wow, that's very good.
Is that good?
That's good.
I want to suck your blood.
I'm very scared right now for many reasons. But
Children of the night, what music they make.
that's really creepy.
That's actually, it's probably werewolves, actually. He was talking about wolves.
Oh, he was?
Yeah, children. It was the wolf howl.
Are wolves children of the night?
Yeah, they were howling. He said, children of the night, what music they make.
I guess vampires are geriatrics of the night. They've been,
Old people.
yeah, they've been around for a long time.
They just keep hanging around.
Yeah. Oh, like, oh my God, that movie. What was that movie? And the movie with Elvis?
Bubba Hotep.
Bubba Hotep?
That was Mummies, but yeah.
Oh, it was Mummies. Oh, okay.
But yes,
still.
there was I think there was talk about doing a Bubba Nosferatu that they never did.
Oh, man.
I don't think it ever oh, maybe it did. Oh, it did. Bubba Nosferatu, Curse of the She-Vampires. I never saw this movie. Oh, wait, no, it's in development. Currently in development. Yeah, it never happened. That's a shame. Bubba Hotep was great.
Yeah. That was a time in our lives.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to open this with a vampire joke, but I realized that all the ones I know, they just suck. Oh, man. Here we go. Here we go.
Good. Oh, by the way, we're slaying monsters. That's Matt there, Matty J.
Call me Matty J.
And I'm EJ. And we're going to talk about some vampires, I guess. Yeah?
Yes, we are. We are going to talk about the Highgate Vampire. The Highgate Vampire, one of the cooler vampires in history. You know, it's funny because there's cryptids, there's like the standard kind of paranormal stuff. And then you have these monsters that are really, we know they're not real, right? Like we know that vampires aren't real. We know that werewolves aren't real. They're a lot less plausible than, say, a Sasquatch or something like that. But every now and then you get these reports that pop up of these real life instances of these monsters. And I think they're so goddamn cool that there's still this belief, there's still the possibility there of these vampires, creatures of the night, stalking the world, feeding on the blood of the living. Like, that's so cool and so implausible, but every now and then it's like, yeah, that happened.
Yeah, and we've had this all throughout history. We've had these like real news reports of vampires.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As we become less and less superstitious, we see them now as fun.
Right.
But yeah, back in the day though, man, they were the real thing back with witches and werewolves and things like that.
Well, certainly. And you know, when we think of vampires, we tend to think of the like classic movie depictions. Caped, pointy-toothed, you know, like the dapper man who lives in the crumbling mansion. They're gothic villains. Things out of romance novels, classical literature, TV series, movies, you know, those sorts of things. The idea of fanged monsters running around and sucking the blood of hapless victims feels quaint. It feels out of place in the scientific world. That's something that we think, oh, that's Victorian, that's, you know, it's historical. It's not something that happens now. And that's why it's so strange that in the early 1970s, a pair of vampire hunters stalked through a London cemetery, stakes in hand, doling out Buffy-style punishment on the undead as they rose from their coffins. But this actually happened, and it happened that recently.
That's crazy to me.
This is the story of good versus evil, of satanic rites, occult societies, and blood-sucking beasts, all set against the counterculture revolution of the 1970s in London. The lore, legend, and truth of the Highgate Vampire will be the subject of this series. And just a heads up, we're going to talk about dead bodies a lot in this episode. We're going to talk about death, decay, putrefaction, and it's going to get a little gross. So if that kind of stuff makes you squeamish, maybe think about skipping this episode and jumping to episode 2 when it comes out. Now, my primary source for this series I actually have a whole bunch. I'm going to be using David Farron's book, Beyond the Highgate Vampire, along with his blog about his life and adventure at davidfarrons.com, which is now maintained by his wife. I'll also be using Della Farron's Haunted Highgate. Balancing his account is the blog at friendsofseanmanchester.com. And lastly, I'll be using a pair of outsiders. David Castleton's article, The Highgate Vampire on the Serpent's Pen, and Don Ecker's My Inquiry into the Highgate Vampire, which was published on Paracast. By the early 19th century, London had a problem. And that problem was the dead.
I thought it was the food.
They were kind of related.
Oh, take that, London. Take that, London.
Oh, was that an insult against British food?
Yeah, take that.
Fish and chips, though.
Oh, so good. Fish and chips are so good.
And then all the food that they've taken from other cultures, like curry.
Yeah, that's true. But, I have to say, like, fish and chips, man, that's pretty solid.
But I don't...
Solid.
What is British food, anyway? Shepherd's pie? Is shepherd's pie British? Yeah, it's shepherd...
I think shepherd's pie is British. Shepherd's pie is okay. It can be okay.
I don't know. I was working in a restaurant once where they had shepherd's pie, and I ordered it, and it was one of the most disappointing meals I've ever had. And it was a good restaurant, but it was just like, ugh, this is gross. Anyway. So London has a problem with the dead in the 19th century, right? There's just too damn many of them. So for centuries, the deceased, they've been buried in these small churchyard-style cemeteries. And that was all well and good for a while, but during the early 1800s, London's population skyrocketed from 1 million to 2.3 million. And the thing is, people kept dying. It's just something that happens to everyone. And so suddenly, these church graveyards were running out of space. More and more graves were dug closer and closer together until you practically couldn't fit anyone else below the ground. It got to the point that a gravedigger would sometimes have to stop digging the grave that they were working on because they'd hit someone else's coffin.
Man, overpopulation was a thing back then, too.
Yeah, overpopulation of the deceased, though.
Yeah. Well, then that's why we need to bring them back to life.
Well, honestly, yeah. I mean, if you just called in a necromancer and you reanimated all of the dead people, you'd fix the problem.
Yeah. It's problem solved.
And zombies, they only need to eat salt, generally.
Really? I thought it was brains.
Well, it depends on who you talk to.
Oh, okay.
So normally, in more like traditional voodoo, when you reanimate a zombie, you feed it salt to keep it under control.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Sometimes they would just bury the bodies on top of each other. And other times they would dismember the bodies to help them fit better and just kind of pack all the limbs together in a small space.
That's so British.
It's so creepy.
It's so like it's just like a very like olden time
solution. To the problem. Yeah, they're like, I'll just cut them up.
Yeah, it's like fine. Old Europe. Just like, you know what? They were probably and maybe this is why they should have brought back drawing and quartering.
Oh, because then you just rip them apart.
They just just get it out of the way early, and then
and then it's easy and like compressed. It was the original IKEA.
That's right.
Oh man, it's just gonna get worse from here too. Okay, so this created a whole host of other problems, though. With so many decaying bodies buried in these improper plots, disease quickly became a major issue. Gravediggers were at risk from smallpox and typhus because they were handling so many diseased bodies. And shallow graves and lack of coffins caused rotting bodies to decay, creating noxious odors for blocks around these graveyards.
God, so you'd be going to church or whatever, and it would just stink to high heaven.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure those churches were ripe. Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Easy access to fresh corpses attracted rats, which further spread disease. Decaying body parts could contaminate the water supply, creating even more disease and epidemics. Children played in cemeteries, setting up makeshift bowling pins from discarded bones and tossing skulls at them to knock them down.
Wow.
Yeah. They called this game Skittles.
Skittles.
So remember that the next time you're choosing your snacks at the movie theater.
I wonder if that's what it's from.
I don't think so.
Oh.
I really don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, I actually believe Skittles came from something else. How did Skittles get their name? Oh my God, it actually came from the same, that is what it's from. Comes from a sports game of the same name where the candies resemble the items used in the game.
I don't know of any body part that resembles a Skittle.
I think the thing is that Skittles, the game, existed, but was not... it wasn't always played with bones, but the kids found the bones, and so they played with them.
Oh, yeah. That's very ingenuity. That's a lot of ingenuity from the little children there. Good
Well,
for them.
you know, you're poor, you use
gotta
what
have
you
fun.
got, right?
You gotta have
Yeah.
fun. Yep. It's a tough life out there.
I mean, also, let's be honest. If I was, like, walking around and I found a human skull, I would totally play with it, too. I'd take it home. That's cool.
You would. Yes,
Yeah.
you would do that. And I'd be like, where are we going to put this thing? We have so many other skulls. Where are we going to put this one?
On the mantle
Oh.
with all the others.
Oh, jeez.
So clearly something had to be done about all these dead bodies. In 1825, barrister George Frederick Carden proposed that London needed a change. He visited Paris a few years earlier and had been struck by the beautiful Père Lachaise. Close?
That was
Père
pretty good.
Lachaise Cemetery. This was a 17-hectare garden and burial ground, inspired by English gardens and neo-Gothic architecture. So this is the first time that we had kind of encountered a cemetery that wasn't just, hey, let's stick a bunch of bodies in the ground. This is, maybe we can make it look a little nicer, be it like a prettier space.
Man, I would think that cemeteries would be around a lot longer than that, but that was like...
Well, cemeteries existed. Yeah, cemeteries existed for a long time, but they were just kind of, hey, let's throw some dead bodies in the ground.
Right.
They weren't
and
like...
mostly associated with like places of religion, like churches
Yes.
and things like that. Not
Yeah.
necessarily just in a town randomly like you have now.
Right, and this is where we're going to see that shift.
Right.
Because up until this point, they were neighboring churchyards. And this is where people are starting to say maybe they need to be independent. If they're independent, there's a couple of things that you can get. One, you can make them nice. Two, you can put them outside the city limits, so
Yeah.
the dead aren't going to be so smelly. Or at least we're not going to be affected by the smell of the dead. And then three, you can monetize them.
Yes. Smart. Anytime you can monetize.
Exactly. So this cemetery, Père Lachaise, had a gorgeous landscaping. It had masterfully crafted tombs and monuments. They put a lot of work into it. You know, it transformed these traditional pit and headstone style cemeteries into something much more picturesque. And more importantly, larger and also cleaner. So, of course, Carden's proposal was immediately rejected.
What? Why?
He tried again 5 years and many, many deaths later, and Parliament finally agreed. An act was passed establishing private cemeteries outside of London and divorced from the church. So now they've been privatized, essentially. Over the next decade, 7 graveyards were created, starting with the Kensal Green Cemetery in Kensington and Chelsea. Later known as the Magnificent Seven, these burial grounds reformed London's graveyard problem. Because now they're not overflowing with corpses anymore. And the dead can be moved into these beautiful locations where immaculately maintained gardens form this final resting place for these people. And it gives this level of like respect to the dead that was sort of absent when you just gave it to an undertaker, and the undertaker was like, well, all right, I got cut into pieces. We're going to dig a hole. We're going to throw it in there, you know?
Yeah.
Most relevant to our story is the Highgate Cemetery, established in 1839 and expanded in 1860. Located in North London in the borough of Camden, the ground spans 15 hectares, or about 22 city blocks. So it's big, really big. Burial plots were sold, and the more affluent people now have the option of paying to be interred in this beautiful garden instead of being thrown underground in a churchyard and, you know, maybe you get dug up by stray dogs and eaten by rats.
Or played with by children.
Also possible.
Very scary. Creepy kids.
Creepy. We're going to talk a little bit about this, but this culture, this creep culture, infuses London for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, because they're so surrounded by death permanently.
Yeah.
And it's so ingrained in their culture that they start to create these artistic pieces around it. And this is how you get Frankenstein, and this is how you get the you know, all of these stories, and eventually pave the way for vampires.
I mean, I think it's just so cool. And to be fair, I'm not judgy, man. If I was a kid back then and I saw some bones, I would totally be playing with them too.
Well, that's why I would take the skull home. You know,
it's
why not? Yeah.
You gotta have fun.
You can, I mean, you just gotta figure that those kids dug up the skulls and then made them talk to each other. They definitely did, right?
They definitely did.
Yeah.
They definitely did.
I mean, dude, even Hamlet did that, right? Hamlet found Yorick's skull.
Yeah.
And he like held the skull and talked to it. We're fascinated by it.
We are, it's true. At all times in our history.
Let's talk about Highgate Cemetery a little bit. So Highgate in particular was inspired by the discoveries coming out of Egypt and those elaborate tombs that the pharaohs had. It boasted this place called Egyptian Avenue, section of it. There you had twin columns and a pair of obelisks flanking a stunning stone archway leading to a row of vaults. The whole thing feels like you're stepping through an ancient doorway into a tomb, like a little piece of Luxor in the London countryside. And this is like really appealing to the wealthier population. Be like, oh, cool. You know, we have Egyptomania on the rise. You're like, oh, awesome. I could actually be interred like a pharaoh. That's cool.
That is so cool.
Beyond the Egyptian Avenue is the Circle of Lebanon, where tombs surrounded a gigantic Lebanon cedar tree. Ancient even when the cemetery was established. Like the cemetery was built around this tree.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that tree could be seen from outside the grounds. And it made the whole place feel more like a public garden than a park that was full of dead people.
So somewhere you might want to spend your time and walk through and...
That was how they advertised it, too. Yeah. The year Highgate opened, Penny Magazine featured a picture of the Egyptian Avenue on the cover. And rather than having like mournful, kind of sad, black-clad funeral attendees, the drawing depicted people out for strolls, marveling at the architecture and the grounds. You see the cedar tree in the background, and in this advertisement, there's no tombstones, no gravestones in sight at all.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it presented it as a park, not a place that the dead resided.
Is the Lebanon tree still there?
Unfortunately, it had to be cut down.
No!
Recently, yeah.
Recently?
Yeah, recently. It finally died.
Oh, it died? Oh,
yeah.
that's sad.
Yep.
Okay.
So clearly, cemeteries had become fashionable by the mid-19th century. But that only stemmed the flow of dead bodies and redirected them into these new cemeteries. London still had a huge cache of partially dismembered bodies buried in crowded churchyards. We got new bodies, and they're going to the nice cemeteries, but it doesn't fix the problem that London has right now.
Yeah.
You know? So we still have these places that are foul, toxic, and then they're also becoming a target for body snatchers who would break in and dig up the freshly interred dead and then sell them as cadavers for a quick buck. Yeah, and this is a crazy little footnote, but selling dead bodies is such a huge part of medical research and has been, and actually kind of still continues to be.
Still continues to be, yeah.
A little bit. There was that great Unsolved Mysteries about the head that they found.
Yeah.
Where they talked about these like body auctions that still happen where you can buy like unauthorized dead bodies in places.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, that idea isn't going anywhere.
No.
I'm just surprised that they would allow this to happen back then with, well, not allow, I mean, anything could.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't allowed.
It wasn't allowed.
You would be arrested if you were caught.
But I'm surprised that people took the risks like that, because if the grave diggers were getting typhus and all kinds of like illnesses, then digging them up would also make you very sick, I would imagine.
I'm not sure we knew that.
Oh, okay.
I think that is something that we now reflect back on and say, oh wow, that was a way that the disease was being transmitted. But at the time, I believe it was just considered a potential casualty of the profession, kind of like how now you have like concrete workers or carpenters or something. You're like, oh, you're probably going to destroy your lungs from all the sawdust or all the concrete dust or whatever. It's just part of the profession. I think we just assumed it was back then.
Okay.
In the 1850s, Parliament passed another burial act. This one forbid burials within the city limits, except for the royalty. And the intention of that was finally like, we gotta stop just pouring people into these cemeteries by the churches. This act, combined with the rising popularity of the Magnificent Seven, was the proverbial nail in the coffin for inner city cemeteries. Many closed, leaving abandoned lots filled with abandoned bodies. These became town dumps, where carriage coaches threw their horse excrement and citizens left trash. Looters broke in, robbing graves and stealing everything of value, even the tombstones.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
Because
heavy.
Tombstones?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know. The thing is, like, they passed this act without any real intention of or understanding of what the fallout would be. And so they're like, okay, now you can't bury anyone in these yards anymore. And that essentially barricaded them. And so everyone was just like, well, now they're fucking garbage dumps, you know? They're dumpsters.
Man, we are never escaping the grossness of our
humans are fucking
society.
Foul, dude.
It's crazy. I like learned like I learned a while back the Dock Street area of like Old City Philly used to be this canal, this putrid canal full of just dead things and garbage and sickness and everything, and they were just like kind of live in that swampy, you know, because it was very low to it was like sea level down there, and it's this very gross. And then eventually they filled it in, you know, did what they should have done there. But I think we think about the disgusting aspect of how many people are on this planet and how much garbage we have, and we just I mean it's just getting worse and worse, but it was back then too. Like it was, and they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't have the proper planning or knowledge of anything, and it was bad. It
was very reactionary too.
Yes.
You know, like this. They shutter these cemeteries, and then you're a carriage driver, and so you're like, oh, my horse excrement bucket is full. Well, this place smells like death. I'm just gonna throw it in there.
Yeah.
And then it takes until that becomes a problem, and then Parliament reacts again, which is exactly what happened here.
Yeah.
Then they ordered that these graveyards, oh shit, you gotta clean them up.
Yes.
And you gotta clear them. Like, you gotta clear these dead bodies out of here so we can make these nice again. And that spawned a massive disinterment project. Bodies were dug up and shipped out of the inner city to these surrounding graveyards, the Magnificent Seven. Lee Jackson, in the book Dirty Old London, The Fight Against Filth, writes, "The corpses of children were frequently carried to the places of sepulture in cabs, and that it was not uncommon a sight to see a string of such vehicles filled with dead bodies waiting at the gates of an unconsecrated burial ground until they could be admitted." So think of, you have a train full of dead children just sitting outside this graveyard waiting until there's a plot that they can dump them in. Jackson continues, "He need not say that on such occasions the solemn services of the church were performed in a slovenly, irregular, and indecent manner." Meaning they just threw the bodies in the ground.
Yeah, there's just so many.
Right. Jackson also wrote about one incident where this procession of the dead was marched down the street next to a school in full view of the students. As the children watched, the carriages carried these deteriorated and broken coffins, barely hiding corpses in various stages of decay. So even with these new, opulent cemeteries, London can't escape the sights and smells of the dead. Let's talk about those smells for a minute, because that's one of the more fascinating parts of this story. We all know dead things smell like death, right? But British undertakers had created a scenario that took that noxious smell to the next level. See, when you die, your body produces gases as it decays. That's the result of bacteria, which are feeding on your corpse and expel methane and ammonia. These gases expand inside our bodies, and that gives the dead that like bloated look. And that's why they smell so bad. But now, imagine you've got a body inside a sealed wooden coffin pumping out these gases. Embalming wasn't a common practice in the early 19th century, so there was no hope of reducing the pressure of this process. And even with embalming, sometimes it still happens. Coffins were essentially these pressurized boxes, and sometimes that pressure became too much to bear, and they would explode.
That is crazy town.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't uncommon to step into a 19th century mausoleum and see a coffin lid busted open, pieces all over the place, and a liquefying corpse exposed to the air.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I can see how people would think that there was something supernatural going on if they didn't know better.
Well, exactly, right? So you have this scenario now where sometimes you would walk into a mausoleum, or you would have not interred somebody quick enough, and you would see this coffin. It looks like it's busted open from the inside.
Yeah.
And the body, like maybe the body's in a state of decay. It probably is, right? But it's still enough to make people wonder. And so there's a couple of different things that they jump to. Number one, obviously, is maybe this is a vampire. Maybe this is a creature or an undead creature that was trying to break out and managed to do so, to escape. And then, of course, the other one is maybe these people were prematurely interred.
Which happened.
Which actually did happen, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But to cap off our section on smells, the undertakers and graveyard overseers, which are called, do you know what they're called? People who run a graveyard? We call them caretakers sometimes, but there's another word for it. It's sexton.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Cool.
So sextons knew that sometimes coffins would explode. They've experienced it. It was so common that part of a sexton's job was actually to tap the coffin like a keg. So they would drill into the coffins and release the pressure. But instead of a flow of good ale or wine, outpoured the stench of death and all kinds of juices from putrefying bodies.
These poor people.
I told you this was going to be gross. So the point is, you got a bunch of coffins with holes in them. So things really smelled like death. Despite the beauty and the landscaping of the Magnificent Seven, there's still hard places to just kind of go and casually hang out in. Like, you wouldn't want to have a picnic there.
So even though they're buried probably 6 feet down, and there's all this soil over it, it still smelled really bad?
Well, so it's not just underground burials, too. Because there are a lot of mausoleums there as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of those cemeteries where, we'll talk about it when we actually get to the amount of people that are buried there. But you have about 2/3 underground and then 1/3 above ground in mausoleums. Okay. Because they're like families and estates, and so they're all kind of put together.
Yeah. Okay.
Also, I mean, the other thing about mausoleums is people thought it was kind of insurance against premature burial.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
This continual presence of death had a massive impact on the average Londoner's psyche, obviously, right? It's no surprise that Victorian people became obsessed with death. Look at Frankenstein, Turn of the Screw, Picture of Dorian Gray, Dracula, of course, right? All of these other stories about ghosts, monsters, the dead. In addition to their literary obsession, rising scientific education and study drove conversations around death and dying too. Up until this point, there were 2 markers of death. Do you know what they were?
What do you mean by markers of death?
So, like, if you were an undertaker and you were called to somebody's house and there was a supposedly
that's how you could tell
body,
they were dead?
And they were like, I think she's dead. How would you prove that person was dead?
I think you put a mirror in front of their mouth.
Yep, breathing was one of them.
And then the other one was, I would say maybe like a pinprick. Oh, a heartbeat?
Heartbeat.
Oh,
yep.
Okay.
Yeah, if a medical examiner, they would try to spot your breath on the mirror held up to your face. They would try to find your pulse. If both of those were unsuccessful, you were declared dead.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
It's not enough.
The problem is sometimes that didn't mean a person was actually dead. Yeah. Sometimes a weak pulse is just undetectable. The same goes for slight breathing. And sometimes a person may actually medically die for a minute or two but come back to life later. Not as a vampire or a zombie, but through a wild medical anomaly called Lazarus syndrome. You ever heard of this?
Yes.
Okay. Lazarus syndrome, it's a spontaneous, seemingly unprompted return of cardiac activity after a patient has been declared medically dead. The name, of course, comes from biblical Lazarus, who famously died and was brought back to life by Jesus as the first zombie. I don't know if Lazarus fed on brains after that, but I don't think we can rule it out.
Definitely not.
We still don't fully know what causes real-life Lazarus syndrome. The assumption is that prior resuscitation efforts sometimes have delayed results. So, like, if you were to apply CPR, that action can raise the pressure in the chest cavity. And then that pressure drops over time, sometimes as much as 10 minutes after the CPR has ended, which can jumpstart the patient's heart. A 2023 paper published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine studied the recorded cases of Lazarus syndrome and advised that medical professionals should be cautious of declaring death and ending resuscitation efforts too early because of this syndrome.
Wow. It makes me also think about people who are like in a coma, or not necessarily in a coma. Well, it does make me think of people in a coma, but there's also people that have the, I don't know what it's called, but it's when you are paralyzed and there's no
locked in
syndrome. Thank you. When you have that, imagine how many people had a locked-in syndrome. I don't think it's that common, but it probably happened. Then they were buried and they're completely aware of everything going on.
2.3 million people in London. I'm sure it happened to some of them.
Yeah. That's more horrifying than anything.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's a great Stephen King story about that, where they're doing an autopsy on somebody with locked-in syndrome.
Jesus.
Now, Lazarus is a favorite dude when it comes to naming things, like the terrifying Lazarus sign. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a reflexive movement that brain-dead patients sometimes exhibit. The patients, which effectively have zero brain function, remember, will reflexively raise their arms and cross them over their chest in a position that resembles Egyptian mummies. While we now know that this is an involuntary movement sent by a signal that is completely divorced from brain activity, it's still a shocking thing to witness.
Mm-hmm. And it's not that crazy to think because insects do it too. Insects go
do
like
they
this
really?
But when they're dead, they cross their arms and legs.
They do. I never thought about that. Yeah.
So I wonder if it's similar.
There might be.
Somebody smarter should tell us if that's true.
Do insects exhibit Lazarus' sign? slangmonsterspodcast@gmail.com. All right. But getting back to our Victorian friends. To them, all these new discoveries rocked their world when it came to death and dying. So if medical professionals sometimes made mistakes and pronounced people dead when they weren't, that meant some people may suffer the worst and most terrifying fate of all, being buried alive. And this is supported by the fact that sometimes you walk into a mausoleum and you see that there's a coffin that's broken open from the inside. Yeah. The most notorious case of a premature burial comes from 17th century England. Alice Blunden. You ever heard of Alice Blunden?
No.
She's like the premature burial case. Okay. She was described in Bagent and Millard's History of Basingstoke as a, quote, fat and gross woman and a heavy drinker.
That is not nice.
They're really, really cruel to her in this article. Okay. So one evening, instead of her usual brandy, she mixed herself a tea of poppy water. Now, dried poppy seeds contain codeine and morphine, so it was essentially a very powerful opioid that she was drinking. Alice lapsed into a coma, and no one could wake her. The apothecary wasn't able to detect breath on a mirror, and he pronounced her dead. According to the text, since it was so hot and she was so fat, they had to bury her immediately, although I'm not entirely sure why her weight necessitated this. For some reason, the History of Basingstoke goes out of its way several times to point out how heavy she was, as if that's like the explanation. Or like, they had to bury her right away because she was really fat.
And this is the 1600s, so she was probably like 120 pounds.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Everybody's like...
Yeah, she wasn't malnourished.
Yeah,
so they were like,
wasn't.
oh, she's so gross.
Yeah, yeah. She's like this like beautiful supermodel, like, or not a supermodel, but like, you know, this, oh my God, that's funny. Well, she sounds like a fun person, honestly.
Yeah.
I want to hang out with a fat, gross drunk from the 1600s.
Yeah, she's just like, yeah, have some of this tea and stuff.
Yeah, she's like a female Falstaff.
It's kind of hilarious because she normally had brandy and she was like, I feel like having some opioids instead of brandy.
Yeah.
So 2 days after Alice's burial, children playing near her grave, because that's kind of what you did at the time, they heard a strange sound like a woman's voice. I get the sense that the graveyard was actually close to their school, which just makes the whole thing feel even more like a Stephen King story. Like, they had to cross the graveyard to get to school, and occasionally they just heard voices talking to them.
It's so goth.
So anyway, the kids told their schoolmaster, who told them to stop lying and probably hit them with a ruler.
Yeah.
But they pleaded with him, and so the next day, he finally agreed to go and see what all the fuss was about. And sure enough, when he got to the graveyard, he heard Alice crying for help.
Oh my God.
They tried to dig her up, like the school teacher and the kids, but it took a while to get to the coffin. And by the time they finally opened it, they found a terrifying sight. Alice was bloody and bruised. She'd been fighting against her tiny confines, and between her self-inflicted wounds and lack of sustenance, she was near death. But she was alive. She had been buried alive. For some reason, there was not a doctor present. I get the sense that this was probably a small town and they had to send for a doctor.
Yeah.
Unable to move Alice without further injuring her, the assembled rescuers decided the best thing to do is just leave her in the coffin until the doctor could come the next morning.
Oh my God.
One man stayed behind that night to watch over her. But when it started to rain, he closed the coffin lid to keep her dry and went for a drink in the pub.
Oh my God.
This really fucking happened. This is a true story. The next morning, the doctor found her dead, with her clothes shredded and her lips torn off. Apparently, she had awakened in the middle of the night, found herself back in that coffin, this little prison, and essentially went crazy. She panicked. No one, from the coroner who pronounced her dead to the night watchman who abandoned her, were ever convicted, although several fines were handed out for neglect.
You know, that's the best they could do back then, probably.
I mean, I guess so. They were just like, oops, made a mistake, I guess.
Wow.
Still seems like the dude who shut her back in the coffin and went for a drink should have had something more than a little fine.
Some public shaming, maybe?
Yeah.
I feel so bad for this woman. This
I
is
know.
so sad. Jesus.
I know. She just
How
wanted a
old
cool
was
night.
she?
I don't know offhand.
She probably wasn't that old.
I don't think she was very old.
This is just so horrible.
It's awful.
Yeah.
What's crazy is that Alice Blunden's story is not as much an anomaly as you would think. During cholera epidemics, people often medicated with opium, inducing comas that passed as death for inexperienced doctors. On top of that, burials moved as fast as possible because the longer bodies hung around uninterred, the greater the chance that the disease was going to spread. That led to mass graves where the dead were wrapped in cloth and doused in tar or pitch before being thrown into the pit.
Wow.
In the early 1800s, cholera had reached epidemic levels in the UK, prompted by the overcrowding of graveyards that we just talked about. People got so afraid of being buried alive that they started to devise fail-safes in case they woke up and, found themselves in a coffin. Mausoleums were a popular option for the wealthy, although, to me, waking up in a stone vault doesn't sound much better than waking up below the ground. The doors were locked, so that meant you woke up, and if you did manage to break out of your coffin, you're still surrounded by other dead bodies, and like we talked about, they smell fucking terrible.
Yeah, and no food or anything.
No food, nothing. And it's not like people are coming and visiting you every single day.
They had to bring back the Egyptian burial, man. With all the stuff, you get the
You get all your
food,
stuff, yeah. Yeah, you just snack on some apples and shit.
Yeah, and just wait around.
The first so-called safety coffin was commissioned by Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who had a window in his coffin and a lock on the lid instead of having it nailed shut. He was buried with 2 keys, one for the coffin and one for the mausoleum door, although he never ended up needing them. During the height of the cholera epidemic, Dr. Johann Gottfried Tabager devised a new safety coffin, one which featured a miniature bell tower above the ground. This bell was connected to the corpse's hands with a string, and the bell itself sat in a housing that protected it from the elements, so it wouldn't rust or anything like that. The idea was that if someone came to and found themselves trapped, they would probably panic and their motions would ring the bell, which would alert a watchman or the sexton who could free them. There are apocryphal claims that this is the origin for the phrases dead ringer or saved by the bell, but there's actually no evidence to support that theory.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh.
No. Do you know what dead ringer comes from?
No, I don't.
It comes from horse racing. You would run a horse under a false name or pedigree.
Oh.
Dead ringer, similar, right? A dead ringer for something else. And then saved by the bell.
I have no idea. That's probably based on the 1990s sitcom Saved by the Bell, which was an incredible...
Screech.
Yeah, incredible Pulitzer Prize winning
It won a Pulitzer Prize, even though it was a TV show?
Yeah. It won everything. It won
Wow,
the Nobel
impressive.
Peace Prize. It was an amazing show.
Saved by the Bell comes from boxing.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. That makes more sense. That was going to be my second guess.
Over the next century, the Magnificent Seven slowly filled up Highgate Cemetery among them. Probably the most notable person to be buried in Highgate was Karl Marx, who had been living in London at the time of his death. All in all, 170,000 people were interred at Highgate across some 53,000 graves. So that's, a lot of mausoleums there.
For real, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But the grand plan didn't hold up. By the 20th century, Highgate, like many of the seven, was completely full and no longer profitable. Because the problem with a for-profit cemetery is once you run out of space, you're not making money on it. Mm-hmm. Cemeteries don't make passive income. 2 back-to-back wars with a global depression mixed in decimated Britain's economy. Repeatedly coming up short on payment for its shareholders, Highgate fell into a state of disrepair. Once majestic tombs and granite lay cracked and broken, and graffiti became commonplace. Of course, vandals broke in and just had their way with it. The trees and bushes, once this beautiful feature of the cemetery, this thing that they thought was going to attract people to come and sightsee there, it becomes wildly overgrown. There are animals that start living there. There's a whole population of foxes that starts living in Highgate. More modern cemeteries, with things like mowed lawns and simple headstones, become the new norm. They're easy to keep up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it was in this overgrown, disused cemetery that a legend of a vampire rose from the grave. Now, mysterious figures had been reported in and around Highgate for over a century, dating back to before the land was even a cemetery. The original estate on which the cemetery was built was said to be haunted. So you're on the back foot already. You're building a cemetery on a haunted estate.
Well, it is England, man. Lots of stuff. Lots of shit went down in England.
Oh, yeah. Allegedly, that estate remained condemned for years, unable to find a buyer because it was so haunted.
Really?
Until finally Highgate came in and was like, well, we'll put a cemetery here.
Perfect. Yeah.
The graveyard itself was said to be haunted by a top hat wearing ghost who stalked through the graves and tombs at night. A very fittingly Victorian ghost for a Victorian cemetery.
Yes. It would have been more interesting if it was like a ghost. Well, that wouldn't make sense. I would say a ghost from the future that was wearing like a baseball cap and everything. That'd be more realistic.
Well, there is also the story of a ghost on a bicycle who likes to ride uphill.
Huh.
It's unclear. One of the articles I was reading said, it's unclear whether the bicycle itself is also a ghost. There's also been reports of spectral nuns and banshee screams in the cemetery. But I think the best ghost story of all to come out of Highgate actually comes from Francis Bacon and his chicken. So Francis Bacon was trying to come up with a method of preserving meat using refrigeration. And so he killed a chicken and stuffed its body full of snow, thinking this is going to help preserve it. But in an ironic twist, Bacon himself caught cold and died during this experiment, and his frozen chicken went uneaten. Ever since, Highgate residents in the area of Pond Square, I swear this is true, report a plucked chicken running around and clucking before disappearing into thin air.
That's really funny.
The phantom chicken, right, was reported as recently as 1970 when it interrupted a couple who were making out on their front step. Imagine you have this date. The date's going really well. Yeah. You take her back to her house. You're like, so can I see you again? Oh yeah, I'd really like that. Yeah. You give her the little kiss, and then you hear the bwah, 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 and you look over, and there's this plucked chicken running around, and then it just vanishes.
Wow, that's a sign that you should get married right there.
All of these stories, except maybe for the chicken, fit the common Victorian ghost story motif. And as luck would have it, there was an organization poised to collect and research all of the stories. The British Psychic and Occult Society, or BPOS, or BPOS. Formed in 1964, this was more than a couple of guys with a van, okay? This was a full-fledged society with membership, executives, and regular newsletters. These amateur ghost hunters met frequently, where they discussed recent hauntings and ghost stories, and sometimes they would even go and they would investigate haunted locations too. The BPOS was obviously very deeply entrenched in the occult and esotericism movements of the 1960s. Now, driven by the counterculture revolution that saw the rise of hippies in response to more traditional Western values, the esotericism movement took everything a step farther. Rejecting corporate and financial values, esotericists looked to paganism and magical rituals instead. Belief and conversation around the occult rose, paving the way for figures like Anton LaVey and his Church of Satan. And I mean, think about the turmoil that existed at that time, right? You had the Beatles redefining music pretty much every year. You have miniskirts modeled by Gene Shrimpton, bob cuts styled by Vidal Sassoon. Psychedelic colors are flooding the streets. And previously, we've had like people in like drab brown and gray suits and shit, right? The economy starts to boom for the first time since World War II. 2 decades after the end of the most financially devastating wars in history, Britain has become an epicenter of culture. And as we see time and time again, these movements create fertile ground for subversive kinds of thinking. And it's no different in Britain in the 1960s. In fact, the Brits had a particular fascination. Do you know what that was? Their own particular brand of occultism? Witchcraft.
What?
Witchcraft.
They didn't come up with witchcraft on their own, did they?
No, but that is the hot topic of the time.
Oh, at that point. Okay.
See, in 1951, Parliament finally repealed the Witchcraft Act.
Oh, okay.
So this was an act that was established in the 1730s, and it made it a crime for anyone to participate in witchcraft or magical arts and carried a year's imprisonment as punishment. This is fucking 1951. They're finally like, oh, I guess that's a bad law.
Yeah, that's a stupid law.
The repeal came to the table in the 1940s when a woman named Helen Duncan was jailed under this act because she claimed to be a psychic medium and claimed to be in communication with some sailor who had died aboard a battleship. Duncan spent 9 months in jail for 2 counts of, quote, conspiracy to contrive the Witchcraft Act and 2 counts of, quote, obtaining money by false pretenses.
Well, I mean, I agree with the second one there, but you know.
Well, and this was the thing that was really brought to Parliament, and this was the thing that really ended up changing everything. 1951, they sort of reshuffled the laws, and the Witchcraft Act was repealed and replaced with what they called the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which forbid anyone from taking money while claiming to be a psychic or a medium.
That can't still be true, though, right? I mean, that can't still be enforced.
I believe the Fraudulent Mediums Act was ultimately repealed as well more recently. Yeah, the Fraudulent Mediums Act was repealed in 2008.
That's it, huh? Because it's crazy for me to think that they would outlaw psychics or mediums or anything like that in anywhere, really, in the developed world. Like,
yeah, you couldn't be like a palm reader in Britain in the 1970s.
That's really crazy to me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you couldn't take money for it. So now, for the first time in over 200 years, witchcraft or Wiccan arts exploded in Britain in the 1960s. And this was influenced by the insanely popular Hammer horror films of the decade, like The Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula starring Christopher Lee, and of course The Witches starring Joan Fontaine. These films, combined with a rising esotericism movement, fed into each other and created this feedback loop where their existence drove more people to explore witchcraft and the occult, which only created a larger audience for Hammer's horror movies. And then they started kind of borrowing different pieces from each other, too. So as occultism becomes more dynamic and the rules expand and the tenets expand, those are incorporated into the movies. And then more people watch the movies and then they go to see, is that real? And oh, it is. And, it's this feedback loop.
Sure.
The British Psychic and Occult Society fits right into this phase. Imagine you've got meetings at people's houses where discussions bounce back and forth from the last horror movie you saw to someone's cousin who's been attacked by a ghost in the cemetery last week, all told by people who are dressed like Austin Powers extras.
That is a really funny, paradox or juxtaposition there.
Isn't it incredible?
Yeah.
It's such a microcosm of time right now.
Yeah.
The founder of BPOS and one of their most active members was a Wiccan practitioner named David Farrant. He'd had a lifelong fascination with the supernatural, having spent his childhood searching local haunted houses for spirits. He also owned a macaw, which often rode around on his shoulder and resulted in his nickname Birdman.
Aw, that's sweet.
By the late 1960s, Farrant had founded his own coven and completed the third degree of initiation. This degree system, it's like a trope in Wicca and witchcraft circles, although when I researched it, it seems like each coven or branch has their own individual stance on what degree means. Some have 4 degrees, some have 3. Some claim a third degree practitioner is ready to lead a coven. Others say they can actually affect planetary alignment and gain animal protection. So
Wow.
There's not a whole lot of consensus as to what a third degree practitioner is.
I want what they're smoking.
It's not really that surprising when you think about Wicca. It's a religion that tends to be devoted to sex built on ungovernance. That's sort of what it's all about, is not having rules.
Right.
Farrant's background and position put him in the perfect place to hear stories of the occult and the paranormal, like the ghost chicken or the ghost bicycle.
Yeah.
But the story that really caught his attention was the story of a hypnotic vampire lurking in Highgate Cemetery. This story came from a photographer named Thornton, which is an alias used by Della Farrant in the book Haunted Highgate. Thornton recalled a photographic session and walk through Highgate in the summer of 1969. As night fell, he spotted something lurking in the shadows among the tombs. Whatever it was, it captivated his attention, almost as if he was hypnotized and was unable to look away. Terrified, he broke free from the shadow and fled for the exit, but he got lost. He described that he was confused and disoriented, and he couldn't figure out how to escape. All the while, he could feel a presence behind him, stalking him. The tolling of a bell drew him toward it, but as he approached, the presence behind him only grew stronger and the air colder. A noise caused him to spin around, bringing him face to face with a tall, dark figure. Panicked, but unable to move, he could only watch as the figure disappeared before his eyes. Spooky. Now, Farrant was experienced enough with the paranormal to know that ghosts are not generally hypnotic. So that's the thing that he latched on here, is this hypnotic quality to this story. And the fact that whatever it was, it confused this man, it disoriented him, it made it hard for him to escape. And then it seems like the tolling of the bell was also part of that hypnosis as well, part of the spell that he was under. The appearing and disappearing black figure may fit a spiritual explanation, but the confusion, the delirium, doesn't fit a traditional, quote-unquote, traditional ghost explanation.
Right.
Whatever it was, this was new to Farrant, and it was fascinating to him. Now, it wasn't long before a second witness popped up, too. This one was an older woman who had a terrifying encounter in the same cemetery in Highgate. She'd been out for a walk when a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes appeared before her. She said the air turned cold and the red eyes appeared to float in front of her eyes and draw her nearer and nearer, like it was bringing her toward it. She escaped unharmed but frightened.
I feel like when you're in a place that you might not be totally familiar with, like with the first guy, I'm talking about the first guy.
Yeah.
It's like, I wonder if feeling lost fed upon the disorientation, and then those two things fed upon each other. Like you're in the woods and you are lost in the woods and your panic sets in, and panic can make you feel all kinds of crazy things that you normally wouldn't feel. So part of me thinks that this is, I feel like at least I feel like the disorientation is very easily explainable.
Yeah, it's hard. But, when you watch these ghost hunting shows and they're like, I feel really angry or I feel really sad or whatever, it's not something that is at all provable or at all any legitimate evidence.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah.
And so to have somebody who was in a cemetery and then got scared and couldn't find his way out, yes, that fear feeds into the disorientation feeds into the fear, and then all of a sudden, sure, we don't really know.
Yeah.
These stories are sort of they don't have much basis here. It's hard to investigate one person's report that is, I saw something weird.
Yeah, right.
And even David Farrant knows that. That the one-off reports are kind of nothing without some kind of evidence.
So clearly you need to investigate.
Exactly. If these reports are true, Farrant thinks, this could be a real supernatural presence. One obviously powerful, prolific enough to be seen multiple times. This is, he's got this new coven. He's running this psychic society, this occult investigation. It would be really good for them and for their legitimacy if they could be on the forefront of reporting something like this. So, and to him, he's very proud of his Wiccan training and upbringing and all. I don't know if it's upbringing, but his training. He's very proud of his Wiccan training. And he believed that his Wiccan training had prepared him to deal with a malicious entity, that he was protected by it. And so he knew what he had to do. Go and spend a night in the graveyard and confront this evil entity himself. And that's where we'll pick up next time, with his personal encounter with the Highgate Vampire.
Oh, how exciting. He's like, I've been waiting my whole life for this moment.
He kind of did. That's kind of what it was. He had been so involved for years in ever since the repeal of the Witchcraft Act. He had been involved in Wiccanism and reading about it and reading about the Church of Satan and things like that. And he didn't, to be clear, he was not a Satanist either. He was a Wiccan practitioner. And he would very deliberately divorce himself from that Satan teaching. But yeah, he definitely thought that he and his magic carried protection and power. And he just jumped at the chance to be able to use it on something that was like this evil entity.
Amazing.
It's so good.
Cool.
Yeah. So next time we're going to learn about his encounter with the vampire, and then we are going to learn about the religious figure in this story who is also going to challenge the vampire.
Oh, how exciting.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. So there you go. That's your introduction to the Highgate Vampire and to the cultural situation that London is in at this time. Because you have a society that for years has been just surrounded by so much death. And we skimmed over the fact that you had, dead bodies all over London. You have these plagues, you have these epidemics and stuff. Then all of a sudden you have World War, Depression, World War.
Yeah.
And then finally things are starting to like level out in London again. And it's in the midst of all of this that we start to see the Highgate Vampire.
Part of me wonders if people just want something to fight. Things are good. And you're like, oh, I don't know. I wonder if there's something about that. I think you can argue both ways. Like, if the world is terrible, then superstition rises. If the world is good, like if your society around you is doing good, people start to look into superstition out of some kind of need for more.
You have the space for it.
Things are calm.
Yeah, you have the space for it to think about it.
I don't know. I also just curiously want to get to the bottom of, like, how is it that the British culture is so goddamn funny? And I feel like part of it has to do with the fact that they have, like, for millennia from, like, the very beginning have had to deal with the darkest shit. Like, they like, not only was dark shit put upon them, but they perpetuated dark shit, and, like, they were involved in so many wars, and I don't know, I just feel like the
many
Brits,
of their own making.
And that's what I mean, yeah. And I think that, like, there's something about just all of that and the craziness of the craziness that went down on that little island. I just think that there has to be something connected there with how freaking funny they all are.
And
so, like, not all of them, but, like, the comedy that comes out of Britain is, like, amazing.
And I think the thing you have to keep in mind as we talk about this whole Highgate Vampire story is that everyone throughout the whole process looks like they stepped out of Austin Powers.
I know, that's why this is so funny.
This is everything is psychedelic, everything is shagadelic, baby.
Yeah.
Like it really fucking is.
Yes.
If you look at some of these people on their investigations and stuff, that's the kind of clothes that they're wearing. That's the hairstyles that they have. Like, these guys, for whatever reason too, these psychic investigators, the BPOS, they're actually pretty trendy. Like, they really are. And it's fucking wild.
They're not schlubs, huh? They're not like, I feel like a lot of our ghost hunters now are kind of schlubs.
Yeah, they sort of are.
These guys are
sort of. This is why we need fucking Living for the Dead, because we need the people to come in there and elevate this culture and be like, no, you can look good while you do this. You don't need to wear fucking graphic tees all the time.
Yeah, every single one of those people looked awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring this back.
Kills me.
It's a travesty that show got canceled.
Yes.
Anyway,
well, I hope that this was an episode that you could really sink your teeth into.
Oh, so funny. Good.
Yeah. And tune in next time as we continue our journey in Highgate with the vampire.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much for listening. Be safe out there. Thanks for listening to Slaying Monsters, the Paranormal History Podcast. If you like the podcast, there's a couple ways to show your support. You can tell your friends, you can leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform, or you can head over to slayingmonsterspodcast.com and click on the Support Us button to leave a donation. For questions, suggestions, and other feedback, reach out to us, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com, and stay up to date by following us on Instagram @slayingmonsterspodcast. Your support helps us grow, and we are truly grateful to have our listeners and community.